Finishing the course of normal physiology, we are going to study the higher nervous activity. The following issues are going to be considered: the innate and acquired behavioral reactions, conditioned reflexes, their formation and inhibition mechanisms, and finally, the types of the higher nervous activity. Before consideration of the higher nervous activity, it is necessary to distinguish it from the lower nervous activity, which includes nervous processes that provide implementation of the innate behavioral reactions. These innate reactions include the unconditioned reflexes and more complex instincts. Let's start to consider from the unconditioned reflexes. And first is the definition. The unconditioned reflex is innate, genetically determined, specific for species, stereotype reaction of the organism to the biologically significant stimuli of external or internal environment that is performed with participation of the central nervous system. The last part of reflex definition is true for any type of reflex, not only unconditioned. Perhaps you remember that the concept of a reflex itself was introduced by René Descartes, a French philosopher and scientist of the 17th century. He did not know much about receptors and nervous impulses conduction, but he understood the reflex as signals sending from periphery to brain and then reflection of it from brain back to the periphery, muscles for example. The key word here is reflection. He did not use the term the signal. He used something like spirits, but nevertheless what he meant generally is close to the contemporary view on reflex. Examples of unconditioned reflexes. When we are thinking about examples of unconditioned reflexes, the first what comes to mind is muscle stretch reflex. Muscle stretch reflexes are routinely checked during neurologist examinations and include knee reflex, biceps, triceps reflexes, ankle reflex, and so on. There are many reflexes. The other somatic reflexes, for example, are the flexion withdrawal reflex, which is protective reflex in response to damaging action of some stimuli. Then let's, for example, take the blinking reflex. This is involuntary blinking of the eyelids, which is elicited by the mechanical stimulation of the cornea. The touching or some foreign object can be the stimulating factor. Similarly, blinking can occur in response to unexpected touching of the skin around eyes. Also, blinking can occur as unconditioned reflex in response to very strong flash of light, which is also protective reflex. Then, for example, Ashner reflex. We studied many autonomic reflexes, and Ashner reflex is an example of this. This is a decrease of heart rate in response to pressure applied to eyeballs. This reflex is arranged through vagus fibers on the heart. Reflex to brain ischemia. If you remember, this is elevation of blood pressure in response to high PCO2 and concentration of H+ ions in the brain, cerebrospinal fluid. So this also reflex contributes to better blood supply to the brain finally. And many others. Actually, the whole course of physiology represents numerous unconditioned reflexes that really are present in all the people, specific for species, and the stereotype reaction. Thinking about reflexes, we need to remember that all the reflexes listed here at this slide present in all the people and remain permanently through the life. But not all the reflexes are present from the beginning till the end of life. There are some reflexes, the so-called primitive reflexes, that are characteristic only for infants, young babies. They are called infant or nubile reflexes also. There are many such reflexes. Let's give just a few examples. A sucking reflex It's normal reflex that appears as when the nipple is placed between lips of the newborn baby, it starts to suck, and which contributes to normal feeding, breastfeeding of infants, newborn babies. Then palmar grasp reflex, or simply grasp reflex. If object is placed in an infant's palm, the fingers immediately flex around the object, so grasping occurs. And this reflex appears at birth and persists during few months of age, and then reflex disappears. Walking or stepping reflex also is present in the first months of age. Of course, babies are unable to walk at this age, but if the baby is kept vertically and the soles of the feet touch a flat surface, they try to walk, make walking movements by placing one foot in front of the other. And so this reflex also is normal for newborn babies and babies of first months of life. And then it disappears. So you see, reflexes are genetically determined, but not present necessarily the whole life. And there are other opposite examples of reflexes that are absent in newborn babies and young babies and appear much later. The best example here are sex reflexes, which appear after puberty, when corresponding sex organs are formed and sex hormones are produced in necessary concentration. So these reflexes are absent by birth of the humans, but they appear like much later. And still they are specific for species, so it can correspond to all the people, characteristic for all the people, and they are stereotyped and they do not need learning. They appear when the body is ready, they appear themselves automatically. Examples of unconditioned behavioral reflex. One reflex looks like behavior, but really it's also unconditioned, genetically determined reflex. This is so-called orientative or investigatory reflex. It looks like increased alertness, turning of head and the eyes, or at least eyes, to the direction of the sudden stimulus. This is important reflex that can be considered also protective, because some sudden events can be important for us and we should pay attention to this. It can be some positive, but even more important, it can be something very important negative for us. It can be dangerous. So we pay attention to the sudden unexpected stimuli. And each time when, for example, the loud sound appears, we pay attention to this because it can be important. Then, if, for example, someone enters the room where we sit, we all turn heads in the direction of the room. But sudden stimulus, pay attention to this, because if one person enters, or after some time another person enters, we again pay attention to this. But if there will be a group of students entering our room and we'll pass filing one by one into the room, perhaps it's not sudden anymore, and perhaps we will come back to our consideration of something and will not pay great attention to the people that enter the room. But if it is a sudden event, we always pay attention, and this is unconditioned, genetically determined reflex. In animals, this reflex also involves investigation of a new surrounding. For example, the rat placed in the new cage immediately starts to explore this cage, to move through all the corners, near the walls, so that it becomes familiar with all this surrounding, to check is there something positive or negative, something dangerous, and so on. This is the so-called investigatory. It's another type of the same reflex. To know about unconditioned reflex, we need to know one more thing. Many reflexes do not need necessarily participation of cortex, but nevertheless, cortex may participate. Here at the scheme you can see lower level, the spinal cord level, with number 1 is the spinal motor neuron, made large to show how many connections it has. Then there are subcortical levels, some level of the medulla, then midbrain, and so on. And finally, there is a cortical representation area, even for reflexes that occur without necessarily participation of the cortex. Anytime there is a cortical representation area. And for autonomic reflexes, which occur automatically without cortical participation generally, nevertheless, they also have the cortex representation area. Let's move to the next level. Instincts, much more complex type of unconditioned reflexes, but it's not simply one unconditioned reflex. It's the complex sequential innate stereotype behavioral reactions. It's a complex of such reactions that appears as a sequence of different actions that arise under action of the central external factors and require the subtle internal conditions. Usually these internal conditions are corresponding hormonal status of the organism. And also it's necessary to have a triggering stimulus. The instinct's implementation requires participation of the limbic system, of hypothalamus, and thalamus and other structures. But from first look at view, it looks like something complex, but understand that this is type of behavior that helps to survive the individual organism and to continue the generation after generation. Examples. Maybe it's easier to understand what are instincts if you have the examples. For example, there is very complex behavior of birds while they are building their nests. It's not an easy task. Just imagine, even humans are with their hands cannot so easily make such a nice nests that are produced by birds. And this process requires the action, which is not a single reflectory act. It's much more, it's much longer. It involves some knowledge how to do something, and all this knowledge looks like the voluntary, absolutely conscious behavior, but really it's an instinct that is based on the timing. It's the season when birds have their nestlings, and it's moment when the season is corresponding and they start to do it with certain knowledge built into their brain. So they follow the instinct, the complex chain of reflexes. All are unconditioned, but it's not simply one reflex, it's many reflexes, and a process that requires something that looks like understanding what they do. And finally, the products are amazing. Look how the nests look like. And they know how to do it. And it takes time. It's not a single act. Another example, it's an imprinting. Of course, instincts include many others that include the growing of nestlings and growing of any little animals. But imprinting is characteristic not for all animals, it's characteristic mostly for birds, which are born not entirely helpless. They are able to move almost immediately after birth. And it's important to keep them near the mother. So the mechanism is imprinting, which makes them to be more safe because they remain close to their mother. And it refers to duckling and some other nestlings which have the mechanism of imprinting formation. Next some hours, within the first day or some hours after birth, they have imprinting of the first large moving object they see after hatching. Especially when it makes the duck sounds, of course, but sometimes without any duck sounds, just first large moving object they see, they become attached to. And then they follow this first moving object, which is normally, of course, their mother. Now you see how they follow mother. This is because of the imprinting. And that's why they are not lost, usually, and they follow and they flock nearby their mother. Normally, of course, it's mother, but if ducklings hatch without their mother, and in case they are found after hatching by someone, they will form an attachment to this person, to this even moving object they see first. And most famous experiments on imprinting were produced by Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was Austrian zoologist, and he investigated imprinting, which was already known by this time, but exactly his works gave him the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1973. And he intensively studied instinctive behavior in animals. especially in grey-locked geese and jackdaws. They are different types of birds. And in one of his famous experiments on geese, he himself became the first moving object the goslings saw after their hatching. And they started to follow him as if he was their mother. And there are numerous photos you can find where the goslings follow him on each his step. So you see, it's not necessarily really the mother of these goslings, but of course, normally it should be exactly their mother. One more photograph of Corin Lawrence. You see now these geese are already adult, but still, or almost adult, and they still follow him when he moves around. But there are examples exist. For example, here you can observe these ducklings follow the man with the dog, but this time they do not follow the man, they follow this dog, which was their imprinting object. And you see now they follow exactly this white dog, but dog behaves really as their mother. Look at this picture. And they keep close to the object which they consider to be their mother, but really the dog cares about them. So it's just the fun examples of the imprinting. It's one of many instincts that exist in biology. Let's move finally to the higher nervous activity, as we finish the lower activity with examples: unconditioned reflex and more complex type of these instincts. Now let's consider higher nervous activity, which in contrast is the set of nerve physiological processes that provide formation of the acquired biological behavioral reactions, acquired in contrast to innate, and learning. Actually, there is great connection between acquired reactions and learning, because if we acquire something, it means that we learn something. So it's basically the same mechanisms. And the founder of the higher nervous activity consideration in physiology is considered to be the Russian physiologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Of course, his works were done on the basis of many earlier research, beginning from theories of already mentioned René Descartes and continuing by many other names that deserve a separate lecture. But I'm not going to go so deeply into the history of nervous system physiology. And at least one name must be really named here. And this name is Ivan Mikhailovich Sechenov, another Russian physiologist. His book named Reflexes of the Brain, published in 1866, was a great advance in physiology of the central nervous system. It started to consider mechanisms of brain functioning on the basis of reflex theory, while before brain was considered something as the black box, having entirely unclear processes inside. And he first suggested to consider this brain activity as based on the classical reflexes and also having some reflexes in the functioning. But now let's come back to the Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. He is the founder of the conditioned reflexes study. Pavlov's investigation of the conditioned reflexes was accidental, actually. He started accidentally this investigation because really he was studying digestive processes. And digestive processes he studied on dogs. And exactly for these digestion works, he won the Nobel Prize in 1904. But during the works on dogs, when he studied the salivation processes, he noted such a case that experimental dogs began to salivate whenever an assistant entered the room. Observation of salivation is easy, and is in contrast to observation of the gastric juice secretion, of pancreatic juice secretion. And also he used, as you can see on this picture, this is exactly a picture of one of the dogs used by Pavlov in his experiments. You see there is attached test tube which allows visualize the salivation. So saliva ducts immediately empty into this test tube. So salivation and even quantitative estimation of the amount of saliva is possible using this technique. And when he noted this, a natural stimulus for saliva, of course, is the food. But assistant entering the room was not clear why it happens, but he, based on this observation, suggested that salivation was a learned response. And he decided that the site of research assistant white lab codes, the animals started to associate with food presentation, which came next. And then he started to investigate this extensively, and then from digestion he moved to the area of the central nervous system functioning, high nervous activity. And in a series of experiments, he started to try to produce a conditioned response to a previously neutral stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus that normally stimulates salivation is food, of course, and he used food as the unconditioned stimulus. And neutral stimulus, which itself has nothing to do with the salivation, neutral or conditioned stimulus, he used mostly what sounds. Of course, in other series of experiments, he used maybe the other types of neutral stimuli, but most widespread or most famous experiments based on a neutral stimulus sound. And let's see how the conditioned reflex operated. First, conditioned reflex definition. This is individual acquired adaptive reaction of the organism that arises on the basis of formation of the temporary connection in the central nervous system between centers of the conditioned neutral stimulation and unconditioned response execution. First, in contrast to unconditioned reflex, you see it's not stereotype, not characteristic for all the species, but individual and not innate but acquired adaptive reaction. And as for mechanisms of formation of temporary connection, we'll see after next slides. First, let's observe what is generally classical conditioned reflex, which now sometimes is called Pavlovian, because they are Pavlov. And in many textbooks they are called simply classical conditioning. It's classical, so that his words provide the classics of the conditioned reflexes. Now you see unconditioned stimulus food, which naturally produces salivation in dogs when dogs start to eat this food. Neutral stimulus, which is conditioned, because the condition can be different. Bell ringing, and itself, of course, it does not produce any salivation, because it's not normal stimulus for salivary glands. But in classical conditioned reflexes produced by Pavlov, it was done like this. Neutral stimulus was given. Just after this, very soon, unconditioned stimulus was given then. And normally this unconditioned stimulus produces response, salivation. And when it was repeated a number of times, bell ringing, then food is given, then dog starts to salivate. Then again, bell ringing, food given, and dog starts to salivate. After a number of repetitions, number depended on the individual and on some other conditions, but generally it's not very much repetitions. And then finally the reflex was formed. In response to a conditioned stimulus, bell ringing, the dog started to salivate. So this is a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus. So now when there is only bell ringing and no food is given, the reflex is formed, and we can see that salivation occurs in response to the bell ringing. This is the essence of the classical conditioned reflexes. Now let's observe how it is formed, the mechanism of formation. First, before we consider the sequence of events, you should understand what is the scheme to the right side of the screen. Left side shows the ear, left portion of the picture shows the ear and sensory receptors of the internal ear that send impulses through afferent neurons to the centers, first subcortical centers and finally the cortical centers of the brain. If here in this picture you see the cross section of the brain with the subcortical centers, and upper arc line is the cortex. Also here what is shown at the subcortical centers, the efferent pathway that goes to something looks like a muscle. It's perhaps the muscle that helps the ears of the dog stand on end, so it's some reaction to the sound. Then, to the right side of the scheme, you can see the tongue with its receptors and sensory neurons that send impulses to the subcortical centers of the salivary nuclei. And these nuclei in turn send impulses back to salivary glands and salivation begins. But also you can see that there is a cortical representation area named B. So, and if it's clear, let's start to consider. By the way, the pictures shown here are taken from the Nobel Prize winner's site, where works of Pavlov are explained as follows, in the form of the funny cartoon. So these cartoons are from the site of Nobel Prize winners. First, you can see the schematic dog that is resting, and bell just is going to ring. Now, bell starts to ring, and you see classical response, the orientative reflex of a dog. The ears are standing on end, and he pays attention to his sound. But of course, this sound has nothing to do with salivation. Let's see what happens. The receptors of the ear start to send impulses. Now you see the blue balls, they show impulses that pass to the auditory cortex and also produce the reaction of alertness of the dog. And now the auditory cortical centers are active and send impulses around. This is something like irradiation of excitation in the central nervous system, in the cortex. And this radiation of impulses, of course, does not activate many centers around, because, if you remember, it's not enough to have one impulse or one synapse activated for neurons, and just it becomes finally lost between between nervous cells, and this activation normally does not reach the B center, because B center is not active at the moment. But then, very soon, food is given, and dog starts to eat and salivation begins. Look now to the right side of the scheme. Receptors of the tongue and general oral cavity receptors are stimulated, and they send impulses to the subcortical salivary centers and to the cortical representation area. And now the cortical representation area, B, becomes also active and stimulated. And when excitability of this center becomes higher, the weak impulses, which are still sent from A center, auditory cortex, become enough to activate the B center, to find their path to the neurons of the center B, center of the cortical representation area of salivation. And first time these impulses do not produce high activation, but still it makes the initial path. Then, after a number of repetitions, the pathways between A and B centers become stronger and stronger. What it means? Initially, there are numerous connections between neurons, so that the neural network is present in cortex and generally in nervous system. But this network is not used entirely, and some pathways mostly remain unused, and some synapses can be silent. But when there is activation of a certain pathway, it produces the changes. Something which is used becomes developed more and more. And with number of repetitions, what happens? The pathways become strengthened by formation of new synapses. Existing synapses can become more active because their postsynaptic membranes start to include more and more receptors that respond to transmitter released. Then there can be new double-formed synapses from one. There can be two synapses formed, and therefore gradually the connection between centers in this picture, A and B centers in the cortex, connection becomes stronger and stronger. And then finally we got the reflex. Bell ringing produces conduction from A to B centers, which is temporary connection, and it starts from activation of ear receptors. Look at this, now it's red spheres that comes to the cortical auditory center, and then goes through cortical pathways to the center, which is cortical representation area of salivation. And then impulses are sent down to subcortical salivary centers and finally to the salivary glands. So this is temporary connection. It's not forever. If reflex is maintained constantly and bell ringing is mostly supported by food given, the reflex will remain and even become stronger and stronger. But usually life is not steady and everything can become changed. And even experimental dogs may have other series of experiments, and in life the situation can be easily changed, and then the signal initial, like conditioned stimulus can be not anymore supported by unconditioned stimulation, in this case food. And then this reflex can disappear gradually, and that's why connection is called temporary. It may stay longer as long as it's necessary, but when it becomes unnecessary, this temporary connection gradually disappears. So this is the mechanism of formation of classical conditioned reflexes, as it's viewed now. The terms. Now let's list all the terms that are necessary for formation of the classical conditioned reflex. First, it's important, conditioned stimulus should precede the unconditioned one. When food is given before, first, unconditioned stimulus is given first, and then conditioned stimulus is given, the dog will not pay great attention to the sounds or lamp switching on or something else, because food is much more important than any of these stimulations. So the conditioned reflex will not be formed. So at least it should be earlier. And then the period is from less than a second, little portion of a second, up to 3 minutes. Of course, we are not machines, we are biological creatures, and 3 minutes can be plus minus, but usually it's hard to form such a reflex when conditioned stimulus is followed by unconditioned after 3 minutes. The connection is hard to establish, and actually reflexes that are established easiest are reflexes when unconditioned support is given after conditioned stimulus after very short period, time interval. So 0.1 second is the best. If it comes after 1 second or 2 or 3 seconds or even after 10 seconds, it's rather easy to form. But if this interval of time becomes longer and longer, the reflex formation requires much more attempts, much more repetitions. So easiest way to form a reflex is to make this interval very short. The longer is interval, the more difficult becomes formation of reflexes. Then combination of conditioned and unconditioned stimuli should be repeated. It's clear. After just one time, the reflex is not formed. Sometimes it requires only few times of repetitions, but sometimes it can be 10 or 15. It depends on many factors. The strength of the conditioned stimulus should be less than of the unconditioned one. What is strength here? It's not only intensity, but also importance. If you compare sound and food, clearly food is much more important for animals. But strength also includes the intensity. If sound has normal intensity, not outstanding, not extremely high, then it's less than unconditioned. But painful sound will be not normal, and so it may not continue. It may disturb the formation of the conditioned reflex, and reflex simply will not be formed. So, of course, unconditioned stimulus should be much more important and more stronger. Some reflexes formation require the presence of the appropriate motivation. For the salivation reflexes, it's clear. If dog is entirely full with food, salivation will be hardly achieved. So the animal should have at least little appetite or to be hungry. So when the hunger is present, formation of such reflexes that involve salivation will be much easier, and practically not possible to form such reflexes if we try this formation in the moment when the animal is entirely filled with food. The other type of reflexes, conditioned reflexes. called operand or instrumental reflexes. And here the founder of the investigations of such reflexes and most pronounced investigations were produced by Swedish physiologist Boris Skinner. His works were based on usage of specific cages for animals, which was named after him Skinner box. See, this is the example of the simplest Skinner box with just one pedal, but let's see, drinker is available and then also the pedal. If animal presses this pedal, it results in immediate appearance of the food tray. Food tray becomes inserted into the cage. And here the investigator just places the animal into the Skinner box and then everything occurs by the animal itself. First, when rat is placed into the cage, it starts to investigate it. Remember, investigatory reflex. It starts to move any movable objects, it starts to sniff all the corners, to investigate everything what is present in this cage. And very soon it finds the pedal and that it's possible to move this pedal. And when it presses this pedal, the first time without any specific purpose, just to investigate everything, it immediately receives food tray. After one such case, maybe the rat is not associating, doesn't start to associate pedal pressing with food. But after just a few such cases, rats are clever enough to understand and to see the connection between pressing of the pedal and food tray. Here, pressing the pedal is self-initiated motor action. And if it's immediately supported by reinforcing stimulus such as food, and food is important for a rat, this reaction starts to be fixed. And connection between this motor action, pressing the pedal, and receiving of food becomes stable. And this is called operant instrumental reflex. These reflexes differ from the classical condition because here is no participation of the investigator himself, and it's self-initiated reaction. But there is a reinforcing stimulus like a food tray. This is simply Skinner box, and the Skinner boxes can be much more complicated with many pedals, and each time it may give different types of food or it can give water. And also they can be equipped with specific pedals that produce the negative effects, such as electrical shock when the rat presses the pedal. And when this pedal pressing is associated with something negative, so especially painful stimulation, and very soon the rat, even faster than for positive reinforcement, very soon rat starts to avoid pressing such a pedal. So this is type of operant instrumental reflexes. Let's move to the next level, the dynamic stereotype. It's something similar to the higher level in unconditioned reflexes. Simply one unconditioned reflex can be much more complex when it goes in stages, one after one, and next and next and next reflex, which is described as an instant. Here for the conditioned reflexes also there is such a complex sequence. It's a steady sequence of conditioned reflexes that is joined in a single complex by carrying out a common task. For motor skills, the dynamic stereotype is the main base of the formation of such skills. Any control of some equipment, the movements that we use in work, movements used in sports, mostly of course the motor skills, you see, movements. Household appliances control, which becomes automatic. This example of the dynamic stereotype, like riding a bicycle. When a person starts to master this, it becomes very soon a motor skill which does not require even constant attention. Then, for example, playing musical instruments. At first, it's not still great motor skill when it's just in the beginning of work under a certain piece of music, but gradually, with repetitions, it becomes more and more skillful, and finally it becomes easily produced almost automatically, because the sequence of movements, sequence of events is already fixed. And this is a dynamic stereotype. One moment is followed by another. Or it can be a simple thing like person comes home and not everyone does like this, but some people do it. Very steady sequence of events, placement of clothes in one point of the entry, then placement of the bag to the other place and placing the keys somewhere, and some steady sequence of actions produced each time. And also this is example of the dynamic stereotype. Many things we do automatically, and we can think about very different things at the moment, but unfortunately then it's hard to remember, did we close the door or did not? Because the brain was free of control of this automatic task and was busy with other considerations. These all are examples of the dynamic stereotype. Here I'm going to suggest you one of classifications of the acquired behavior for basic forms of learning. This is not the classification for memorizing, because there are so many different classifications. I just want to show one, which is according to Neil Carlson, whom I respect greatly. His classification is one of existing, and as example just, for example, perceptual learning. This type of learning means the recognition of earlier perceived stimuli. So we always can choose the previously known, previously perceived stimuli from the total sequence of stimuli where they are given together with unknown. So it's perceptual learning, according to Neil Carlson. Then stimulus response. There are two types that we already considered: the classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning, and instrumental conditioning, which is operant reflexes, with the reinforcing stimulus. Then motor learning. These are clearly very different. And relational learning, which is usually involved with something like our memory of space around spatial learning, and episodic learning, remembering of sequence of events. And actually facts remembering also includes considered to be relational learning. So our learning of the certain subjects is also included into relational learning. So we see there are many types of different learning. Now, inhibition of conditioned reflexes. It was said already that conditioned reflexes arise on the basis of the temporary connection. And this temporary connection really can become temporary, and the terms of existence of reflexes can be finished. Conditioned reflexes are adaptive reactions, and they provide really adaptation. They provide to be prepared to some events that we know that are coming. And all previous experience shows that this conditioned stimulus is a predictor of coming soon unconditioned support. So it's an advantage of these conditioned reflexes is the preparedness for next coming of unconditioned stimulus. But when situation changes, the conditioned reflex becomes useless. It doesn't provide any more adaptation, and it's necessary to get rid of this. And how this occurs? Let's see. Inhibition of conditioned reflexes may come immediately after the first attempt, after first action of the stimulus. So it's considered as unconditioned inhibition. And also it can be conditioned inhibition. Here the difference is very similar to difference between reflexes themselves. Unconditioned reflex does not require learning, does not require number of repetitions, and when this reflex is already present, even if it's not forever, not for the whole life, when reflex is present, to produce this reflex is just enough to suggest stimulus, to offer the stimulus, and reflex appears. And similarly, unconditioned inhibition. From first case, the reflex becomes inhibited. And conditioned inhibition. Why it's called conditioned? Because it requires learning. It is not produced immediately. On the first attempt, it doesn't happen, but after number of repetitions, the inhibition occurs because it's a learning process. So let's consider the types. First, I'm going to give the types names and then explanation. Unconditioned inhibition can occur by so-called external inhibition, and also it can be protective or exorbitant inhibition. We'll consider next slides. Conditioned inhibition contains more types. One type is extinction, most usual way of getting rid of unnecessary old conditioned reflexes. It can be differentiation, delayed inhibition, and conditioned break. All the types I'm going to explain on next slides. So let's start from unconditioned inhibition, which appears from the first attempt. External inhibition. Imagine, let's take the same situation with dog that responds to the bell ringing by salivation. Just bell starts to ring and dog is ready to begin salivation, but then, for example, there appears the cat. And not that cat that was grown together with the dog. No, it's some unknown cat. And dog responds, if this dog is, has the same attitude to cats as most of dogs have. There is no salivation. Dogs runs and start to bark on cat. And there is immediate inhibition of all salivation that normally was present in response to a bell ringing. Of course, not necessarily cat. If the dog is has the task of protection of the house or yard, and some stranger appears nearby, the dog also starts to bark and to warn the master about the approaching of the stranger, and so also salivation is lost as if it was present previously in response to certain conditioned stimulus. So here the stranger or a cat all are entirely external stimuli which do not belong to stimuli included into a reflex. So for this reflex they are entirely external. And this external stimulus produces inhibition of previously formed classical conditioned reflex. So there is no salivation. This is external inhibition. Then protective or exorbitant inhibition. Again, we consider the same situation. Bell ringing normally produces in a dog the salivation beginning. But now imagine that the same bell rings, but with such an intensity that it becomes simply painful, very, very strong. And dog responds, as you may see. In response to very strong, unusually strong sound, painful sound, dog does not have any salivation. So this is type of the protective inhibition because of conditioned stimulus becomes of an extreme strength. So this is exorbitant because of extremely high intensity of the conditioned stimulus, and therefore protective inhibition occurs. Let's move to conditioned inhibition. Here, types, examples. First type to be explained is extinction. Extinction is the simple process of gradual disappearance of reflex when there is no anymore support by unconditioned stimulation. For example, bell rings, food is not given. Of course, first time it's a true confirmation of the already formed reflex. Of course, salivation appears. After next time and next time and next, but gradually the reflex becomes weaker, weaker, and gradually disappears. The temporary connection is temporary, and then it disappears if there is no support anymore. For humans, it's always not easy to transfer simplest reflexes studied in dogs to humans, because humans have much wider range of actions, but these actions are not simply reflexes. But, for example, you can see, I'm going to give this example, search for pockets. For example, you are used to wear the clothes with pockets, and for a long time you use these clothes and you used to put hands into the pockets, or you used to keep something in the pocket so that you can come with hand into and take the things out. But one day you choose different clothes without any pockets, for example. Then maybe one time or two times you will try to search for these pockets because it's your habit already formed, and it's actually conditioned reflex. And you know where they are located, so the hands are moved exactly on this level and so that the hands will exactly nearby the pockets. But after 1 or 2 attempts, when you find that pockets are not present at all, so then this behavior is inhibited. And this is the extinction inhibition. Another case, differentiation. In classical experiments on dogs, differentiation looks as follows. For example, the reflex is formed for the sound of a bell. And in response to this bell, the dog starts to salivate. Then they give another bell, also a sound, also a bell, but the sound is somehow different. At first, dog does not differentiate the 2 different bells. Bell is given, so the reflex is present, and dog salivates in response to this bell. But after a number of repetitions, each time when the original initial bell is supported by food bringing and another bell which is similar but not identical, food is never given. Therefore, after a number of repetitions, the dog salivation, which initially was present to the new bell sound, this salivation disappears. It becomes inhibited. And the mechanism of this inhibition is a differentiation inhibition. For humans, again, it's not very easy to transfer, but for example, if you have carries particular ringtone in your phone, and someone nearby you have similar, not exactly the same, but similar. Maybe first time you'll pay attention and you'll start to search for your phone if you hear this ringtone nearby. But after a number of repetitions, usually not many, you clearly start to differentiate 2 similar sounds, and you pay attention for your phone only in case when you hear your phone ringtone. It's also an example of the differentiation inhibition, but of course it's more difficult and more complex as compared to simplest salivation reflexes in dogs. Next, delayed inhibition. This is rather easy. Delayed inhibition is only for case when reflex is formed with time lag. Actually, lagging inhibition may be the better word for this, lagging inhibition. If there is a time lag for reflex manifestation, for example, we manage to produce reflex in response to sound, which is delayed. Sound is given and food then is given after, let's say, 3 minutes. And salivation in a dog develops exactly after 3 minutes. 3 minutes after the bell ringing. So this is type of reflex that is hard to produce because there's a great interval between conditioned and unconditioned stimulation. But when it's already formed, we can say that during these 3 minutes, the reflex is inhibited. It's already stimulated because there is no other stimulus other than this bell. But bell does not produce immediate salivation, but only after 3 minutes. So bell stimulated the reflex, but reflex is under inhibition within these 3 minutes. And only then it becomes again seen, and it becomes seen as a salivation. So during this time lag for reflex manifestation, this reflex is inhibited by the mechanism of the lagging inhibition. And conditioned break. Conditioned break is such a type of conditioned inhibition when another conditioned, entirely neutral stimulus is added, and combination of the classical initial conditioned stimulus with a new one is never supported. For example, bell ringing produces salivation. Reflex is already formed. And one day they give bell ringing and at the same time switch on lamp nearby the dog. And first time the dog pays no attention to this lamp, not much, and salivation occurs. And next time it occurs again. But if number of repetition is done when only bell is supported by food bringing and bell in combination with the lamp is never supported. So number of repetitions produces finally inhibition of salivation when lamp is added to a bell. So another also conditioned neutral stimulus, lamp switching on, is here the inhibitory factor, but of course it's not initially inhibitory factor, only after learning number of repetition. And then it becomes conditioned inhibitory stimulus or conditioned break. So at first, addition of this second inhibitory stimuli is not inhibitory still, but after the learning, after number of repetition, it becomes really conditioned inhibitory factor or conditioned break. And now we come to the last part of the lecture, which considers the types of the higher nervous activity. And first we consider our most well-known, the general biological types of higher nervous activity. Actually, at first, these types were described by Hippocrates, and it was before Christ time, 4th to 5th century before Christ. And he described 4 temperaments. As he considered, it was based on the predomination of certain fluid in the body: blood, sanguis, bile, choler, then black bile he considered to be present, melancholy, and phlegma, something like mucus. So the four temperaments received the following name: sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, and melancholic. Sanguine with blood predominant, choleric with bile, phlegmatic with phlegma or mucus, and melancholic with black bile. But doesn't matter what he considered to be basis for these temperaments, his description of temperaments was brilliant, and still we use practically the same characteristics of the 4 pure types. Of course, the pure types, if exist, they are not very widespread. Most of people are mixed, but usually 1 or 2 types of temperaments predominate in a person. So it's necessary to know well the difference between. According to the classification suggested by Pavlov, the 4 temperaments can be distinguished on the basis of strength of nervous processes, lability of nervous processes, and balance of the excitation and inhibition processes in the central nervous system. Before we move to consideration of this, I need to explain that on the basis of experiments on dogs with conditioned reflexes, Pavlov noticed that some dogs produced reflexes quickly and changed into new reflexes easily. Some dogs produced reflexes slowly and were difficult to change reflexes, to inhibit and produce new reflexes. And he noticed that generally even dogs have different types of temperaments. So that's why we say now that is a general biological types, not only humans. So really not only humans do have these types of temperaments. Animals are also different in their types of higher nervous activity. And so, on the basis of these observations, Pavlov started to investigate the temperaments or biological types, and here he decided not to invent new temperaments. Just the same classical, known from ancient Greek time, he tried to do the basis for the same 4 temperaments. And this scientific basis considered the 3 factors for differentiation of biological types. Criteria. Now let's see these 3 criteria by Pavlov. First, the strength of nervous processes of excitation and inhibition. Here options are the follows: strong processes or weak processes. Most of people do have strong processes, but some of people may have weak excitation and inhibition in the nervous system. Then second criterion, lability of nervous processes. And options are labile or inert. Lability is actually the velocity or rate of nervous processes. If you remember, the lability was considered in the basis of the nervous system functioning, and lability was estimated by a number of processes that can occur within time unit. For example, per minute, per second, how many processes can be. For example, lability of nerve, how many impulses can be conducted through nerve per second. For example, 800, for example. This is the measure of lability. So how quickly actually occur these processes, how quickly the excitation can be switched to inhibition and back. So labile clearly can do it quickly, and inert does not easily switch from excitation to inhibition. And the third criterion is balance of excitation and inhibition. Here 2 cases are present: balanced or unbalanced. As you see, with 3 criteria and 2 types for each criteria, we can produce more than 4 combinations. But Pavlov tried to follow the same classification that was the same types that were described by ancient Greek philosopher. And then he developed the following temperaments according to Pavlov's classification. Here we come finally to the same 4 temperaments, but combination of the characteristics can be strong, can be different by lability, and between strong nervous processes we have labile and inert people. Labile also are subdivided into 2 subtypes. Strong and labile persons with strong nervous processes of excitation and inhibition, with high lability, ability to switch quickly. They can be balanced. Process of excitation and inhibition are balanced. And this type, strong, labile and balanced, is sanguine, which was called by Pavlov something like lively or vivid or, let's say, lively. But it corresponds to sanguine temperament by Hippocrates. Then, labile, strong labile, can be non-balanced when processes of excitation predominate over inhibition, and they hardly can become inhibited, and the excitation is predominant. So this is type that corresponds to classical choleric, and Pavlov called it something like unrestrained. But it's the same choleric. Then strong and inert. It is balanced, and it corresponds to the phlegmatic, which was called by Pavlov quiet. Really, a phlegmatic person is quiet. And the only one temperament has no more characteristic, just one, weak, and nothing else. Weak nervous processes where lability and balance is not even considered, and this temperament is melancholic temperament. So these are 4 temperaments from Greek philosophy, and now they are characterized by the criteria from Pavlov. Strong labile balanced, strong labile non-balanced, strong inert balanced, and finally the weak, simply weak. So these are 4 temperaments. As for characteristics, actually I'm not going to describe in detail, just general description. Maybe the best way is represented by the Danish artist, caricaturist Herluf Bidstrup. He made very quick, short, black and white caricatures which refer to many sides of life, and he gave one of the best, shortest explanation of the 4 temperaments with his pictures, and I'm going to show you these pictures. All these pictures are based on one and the same situation that refers to the head of a person, cylinder or simply head. The situation is as follows. All 4 temperaments are seen in the same situation. The person puts somewhere in the park, puts on the bench his hat and sits, and unexpectedly someone comes and sits on this hat accidentally. So let's observe the reaction of the 4 temperaments, and actually characteristics are not necessary even when you see them as they appear in this situation. Sanguine temperament, you see? The moment when he noticed, the sanguine person notices that his hat is squeezed by someone, he just says to his neighbor that about this, and then he simply laughs at it. So this is, according to Pavlov, lively, strong, labile, and balanced. You see that this person is balanced, and reaction is like this: sanguine temperament, with positive emotions predominantly. Then choleric temperament. Actually, from the beginning, it's seen that nothing of good will happen from this situation. Look, now he discovers what happened to his hat, and this is his reaction. Pure anger, unrestrained. That's why it was called by Pavlov unrestrained. He has strong nervous processes of excitation and inhibition. He is quickly labile, but unbalanced. His excitation is hardly inhibited, and you see the reaction. This is choleric temperament characteristic by Herluf Bidstrup. Then Phlegmatic Temperament. Look, he discovers that something happened to his hat. His reaction is entirely phlegmatic. He just puts this hat into his head and continues to smoke. According to Pavlov, he's quite strong processes but inert. It's hard to move him and hard to make it to go out of himself. He's well balanced. This is phlegmatic temperament characteristic in short. And melancholic temperament. Practically also we can notice that initially he is not in a very good mood. Then he discovers that head is squeezed and his reaction is not nice, really. He cries. And according to Pavlov, he is simply weak. Just I need to remind that pure temperaments are not often found, and most of people are a combination of temperaments, one or two predominant. Then, the other classification of the higher nervous activity types, but this time not for general biology, not for animals, only for humans. And it's based on predomination of the certain signaling system. And here you need to know which signaling system exists. The first signaling system is used by all the lively creatures, all live creatures, all animals and humans as well. And it's based on simple perception of all the stimuli of the environment, various stimuli. What we see, the picture around, we see trees, we see sky, we see objects. Mostly the signaling system involves the information that comes to our eyes, the information that comes to our ears, but not related to speech, not words. And this system is characteristic for all animal and humans. But we humans developed the second signaling system, and it's based on the words of the higher type of signal and abstract thinking based on words. Before consideration of the types of the higher nervous system based on predomination of the signaling system, I must admit that some signaling system, some lower level of signaling system, second one, is present in some animals as well. You know that dolphins use the ultrasound to convey information to each other. Even insects can signal something somehow, but by using some specific movements or so. And many other animals of higher level can use some signals and can understand words sometimes, more or less. But at least we may say that our speech is much more developed as compared to any signaling that appears between even dolphins, but about dolphins it's hard to say. We don't know much. But at least monkeys, dolphins and all the others, their speech is not as rich as ours is. And clearly the greatest difference is the abstract thinking. The animals do not go into consideration of philosophic issues like such as what is first materia or substance, materia or spirit, and so on. The abstract thinking, which is based on words, because otherwise we cannot visualize the objects of abstract thinking. Only designation by words, labels, can be used. And abstract thinking about some philosophical phenomena only is characteristic for humans. And abstract thinking is possible only using words and speech generally. So the second signaling system makes us different from animals, and we have two signaling systems, and sometimes one system predominates above the others. And so two different human types with one mixed. Mental type has predomination of the second signaling system. The people are disposed mostly to abstract thinking, to the science, to verbal types of activity. Actually, about writers, I don't insist, because writers, they clearly use speech, but at the same time, they should have great imagination. So actually, they should be in both systems, rather experienced. But you know that some people really are mostly for science, and they don't like any. Sometimes they don't like some other types of arts, like they art at all. They can not like maybe music or poems. They don't understand what is the use of this all, and they like only their numbers, their formulas, and so on. Not all the people, but they're present. And the opposite type is the artistic type, predomination of the first signaling system. These people are disposed to visual arts, painting, music, theater, design, and so on. And also, not necessarily they have worse development of the second signaling system, but there exist some people who don't understand how it's possible to be fond of mathematics, what is logical thinking, and so on. They like only their type of activity, can be some hairdressing or some design or so on. So clearly we have some people that belong to mental type predominantly or to artistic type predominantly. But of course there are people mixed type which have development of both systems normally and equally. And sometimes we have people who have both types development equally, but equally high, unusually high. And here, perhaps you will suppose yourself that the best example is Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps. Of course, he's not the only one. Michelangelo Buonarroti wrote poems as well as he made sculptures. But usually first, the name that comes to mind when we discuss the genius equally advanced in the mental type of activity and artistic type, this is Leonardo da Vinci. His technical inventions can be compared to his paintings, and he was genius in all the sides of his personality. So it's mixed type, but mixed with high development. But among normal people with normal development of both systems, we have many people with equally developed first and second signaling system. And that's all I wanted to explain about the higher nervous activity for today. Of course, it's not limited only by what I said, because it's limitless, endless part of physiology.